Ben and I have known each other a long time. So the background of this relationship is I used to be Ben's CEO coach when he used to be a CEO. And I was joking when I saw him today. We had coffee a little bit ago, but like a month ago. But him and I have done the full roller coaster of startup life together. And he's now on the other end. So I thought we'd start. Ben is now with YC, and I thought we'd start by asking you kind of like, looking back at being CEO of this startup, raising, how much did Cheeseburger raise?
$40 million.
$40 million.
Yeah.
And I still remember our first coffee at Sightglass years ago.
Yeah.
What is it, as you look back, that you realize now that at the time felt like a really big deal or could be the end of the world, that you look back now and you go, in this perspective, that was survivable, even though at the time it didn't feel that way?
This is a great question. So I think a lot of you guys can relate to this, the matrix of important, not important, urgent, not urgent. And when Clayton and I started working together, I was very much in the urgent corner. Shit, the fire that needed to be put out, the shit that was just coming into you and your inbox that you just couldn't ignore. And it turns out you can ignore those things. Because my job is not the urgent. My job as CEO was to work on the important, right? So that shift has dramatically happened since then.
Yeah. And you, after you moved away from Cheeseburger, finished that chapter, traveled the world, you wrote some blog posts about some of those moments. I'm curious, what was the scariest thing for you as founder? I mean, in those blog posts, you were very vulnerable, but what were the moments that?
So I did Cheeseburger for 8 years. I started the company. I bought this cat picture website called I Can Ask Cheeseburger. I bought Failblog, started 50 websites. You know, we launched a cottage industry of internet meme creators. You know, we made millions of dollars. The company grew to 100 employees, and then it shrank. And I stepped down, and we sold the business when I was basically doing a sabbatical. And before I was stepping down, stepping down was very clear. The company didn't need me anymore. It was setting up for a sale. Like, I was just another overhead, and it was time for me to go. But it was the idea of, like, should I be an entrepreneur again? Having gone through this process and having had some success and gone through the tough times, am I A, ready to do it again? Am I B, qualified to do it again? And C, you know, what would I do? Right? And so this question of identity was super hard. And I think there's an incentive for you not to go through the painful process of examining down to the core of who you are as to whether you want to be an entrepreneur or not. You kind of gloss over the surface. Oh, yeah, I'll do it again. It's just a different idea. I'll just get a different team, different city, different business, and I'll do it again. I'm an entrepreneur. So I did that. And it didn't sit right with me. So while I was traveling, I mentioned this to a few of my friends that I wanted to take my identity down to its core foundation, to the studs, and to see if I wanted to rebuild from that.
Yeah. So Ben and I went through this journey together, me as his coach, his as a CEO, and some of the things that, and we're both very open and vulnerable, so some of the things I can reflect back to Ben at the time is you're going through this, you've raised $40 million, you've had to let people go. And before Ben answered the question of, do I want to be a CEO again, there was a previous existential crisis of, I don't want to let people down, right?
Yeah.
I remember there was a really powerful conversation with Brad Feld about letting people down. And Brad said, do you remember what Brad told you? The only way you can let them down is if
you don't try.
Yeah. And he said, and if you don't come to me for your first check next time around. Do you remember that?
Yeah. I actually had a very similar discussion with another friend of mine. He's a B2B venture investor in Mercury at Houston. His name's Aziz Gilani. He and I had the dubious distinction of jumping off of a cliff together, tied to a rope, and it didn't work well. So we ended up getting a bone bruise for like 3 months. So we went through this process together, and I think what happens is, like, when you jump off a cliff with someone, like, you kind of like become friends.
Yeah.
And so we're kind of friends. And I, you know, when things were going down, I was like, oh man, Aziz, I don't know if I'm, like, who the hell's gonna give me money again? I just, like, you know, blew up this opportunity, and we're not gonna make back this money for the investors, let alone a profit. And he's like, why? Why are you worried? I was like, I lost like $40 million right? I mean, more than that if you count the valuation of the company. And he's like, okay, well, did you lie to anyone? I was like, no, I mean, not that I know of. I mean, I'm very unsure of myself at this point, right? Like, not that I know of, but no, I never deliberately misled anyone. He's like, okay, did you tell him any bad news that came across your desk? And I was like, yeah, absolutely. Like, we shared the bad news. We did not sugarcoat anything. And then he's like, did you try your hardest? I'm like, you damn right I did. And he said, great, you'll raise more money. Like, why? Like, there's so many other people who are successful. Why would you give it to me? And he said, because you didn't screw your investors. And I thought that was a pretty low bar. But it turns out that like there's actively screwing an investor, and then there's passively screwing investments, right? You can lie to your investors because you are actively lying. The passive one is like because you're hiding from the truth.
Yeah.
And the second one is the more prevalent one.
Yeah. So as you were going through all of this, right? This is about founder mental health, and the reason why I invited Ben to be sitting up here with me is because he did go through $40 million. He did have to lay off a lot of people. He did have to go to his investors and say, hey, I think it's time for me to leave the company. But as you were going through all of that, what was that like? I mean, you're on the other end. I saw Ben. I said, how are you doing? And he said, I'm great. I don't have employees.
Yeah, so great.
So stepping back to a couple years ago when you did have all of that, when you and I met, how did you get through that? Were there times where you felt anxiety, where you felt depression, and how I think it'd be helpful to talk about, and when you came to boot camp, you found out how normal that was.
Right, you're not the only one suffering from your own delusions.
Can you share a little bit about that, like normalize?
Yeah. So, I mean, I've struggled with depression before. I did my first startup back in 2001. I closed my company down, lost all the money. 9/11 happened, and I went through a depressive episode where I struggled with thoughts of suicide. So the first thing you gotta do is you gotta talk about it, because if you don't talk about it, people die, right? Entrepreneurs out there are going through depression. Someone that you know is probably going through depression. I don't know how bad it is, but they're having thoughts of harming themselves or making irrational decisions. And if you make depression and suicide sound like it's something to be shamed about, then people won't talk about it. If they don't talk about it, then they will actually go through sometimes with the terrible things that are going on in their mind. Thank you. When you talk about it, I think it's very important to realize that these are usually temporary instances brought on by A, circumstance, and two, you not taking care of yourself. And I think there's a huge desire for entrepreneurs to show that they can kill it, that they can just push themselves to the edge and push themselves super hard. And the really good entrepreneurs would come to me and say, Ben, you have to take care of yourself. That's what I did. I took care of my health, I took care of my friends, I took care of my family, and then I took care of my business. Not because it was the last thing that was the least important on that chain, but because all those things work in tandem. And I'm not talking about work-life balance where you work from 9 to 5. Like, that may be bullshit. It may not exist, but you gotta figure out what you have to do to balance the important things in your life. Yeah. And so it's been probably 3 years of working together to try to figure it out.
Yeah. And I just want to say something about talking to somebody with depression. Sometimes we often say, well, I don't know what to say, right? And sometimes a depressed person does not want to talk about it. So whether Ben realizes it or not, every time I saw him through that episode, I gave him a hug. And it was like kind of an awkwardly long hug. But because sometimes what you're feeling when you're depressed is a disconnection, right? And just that human touch is really, really important. And sometimes, whether they can talk about it or not, looking at them and just saying, what you're going through is hard. You're brave, and I'm proud of you, is enough. So, but oftentimes we don't ask because we don't know what to say. And sometimes just those few words and an awkwardly long hug do the trick. And so you reached out to me,
Yeah.
But what other areas of support and places of support did you find?
I was very thankful to have a group of investors who were super enlightened about the human performance part of being an entrepreneur. And so you can look at it one of two ways. An investor who worries about your mental health and wants to take care of you as a person, that is at the human level an incredibly generous and deep connection, right? It is non-financial. At the same time, there's a recognition that without that part, the CEO is incomplete. So Brad Feld, Rich Levendorf, Greg Gottesman, those were my core board members and investors in my company, and I would have no problems reaching out to them and saying, hey, I feel this way, I feel anxiety, I feel like a failure, I feel like this weakness. And they would say, okay, great, let's talk about it. How do we make you better? Right? You are an athlete who has a hamstring injury. How do we make you better? It was at that level. There was no judgment involved in it. And I think that was super powerful, and I don't think there's a sufficient number of investors out there who see that as a value to their portfolio companies. So.
Yeah. I'll say a couple things. Ben did not do this. Ben had stepped away from the day-to-day operations of the company and handed it over to his COO.
Yeah.
But oftentimes you have CEOs staying in the seat of CEO, running the day-to-day from either a highly anxious or a highly depressed state, often both. And what we find in those companies is if you're freaked out and scared, that fear ends up manifesting as aggression. And so you'll have the CEO with a short temper, you'll have the CEO with very low ability to deal with adverse events in the company. And one of the reasons why us as coaches, VCs like you were fortunate enough to have, know to continue to ask, are you sleeping? Are you eating? Yeah. Are you working out? And working out can be like get off the bus early and walk the last 5 blocks, right? Just anything to move your body, is because if you don't release that energy, it's going to manifest in your company. And the most often way is fear showing up as aggression, and we see that quite often.
Yeah. Yeah. Also, do you have a hobby? Right? Yeah. Does your world entirely evolve around your business, or do you have something else, right, that keeps you grounded? Yeah. Right? Those are really important questions to ask. I agree.
Yeah. So another thing that I see kind of as a coach working with CEOs is this personal identity conflating with the identity of the business. So it's no longer, if Cheeseburger fails, that's okay. It's if Cheeseburger fails, I am a failure.
Right.
Right. And those two kind of get fused together along the journey.
And it's funny, the definition of failure, right? So my definition of failure was anything other than a $500 million exit. That's fucking hard, right? Yeah. That's like you might as well set yourself up for failure. And I remember talking to Brad about this, and I said, I want to set a goal. I want to be goal-oriented. I want to drive my business towards that goal. And he's like, you're still pretty young. And he's like, it's about the process.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And he was very clear. He said, outcomes are subject to externalities. Right? Outcomes are subject to the timing of the market, to the luck that you have come across, of shit that just happens outside of your control. But the process, that's all yours. Yeah. So concentrate on the process.
Yeah. So I about 2 years ago, a female CEO was sitting in my office and kind of opened my eyes up to how hard it is to succeed as well. Because I think failure gets a lot of airtime and how hard failure is. And she was sitting on my couch and she looked at me and she said, at least when you fail, the next day you're done. She said, what happens when you're on a train you can't get off of? And she was dealing with depression. She was a child prodigy, like kind of a Doogie Howser type, and all-star investors, and everything was going well, but she wanted off the train. And so another thing that I would say is, don't make the mistake that a CEO that is killing it or crushing it, just because they're getting all the headlines that they're okay. Sometimes that's just as hard, and I know Ben through now YC, but before that through Foundry Group and other CEO networks had a lot of experience working with CEOs that were, hey, I saw you on the front page of this or that. Right. But oftentimes it's even harder on them because they're not supposed to complain, right? And for you, Ben, now Ben went on to travel for a year with his wife, had a wonderful kind of blog. I mean, I got it all on Instagram.
Yeah,
I don't know.
my Instagram's off the charts. Yeah.
Lots of exotic animal hugging and other things. But looking kind of, you work with YC on the research side, but you see a lot of young founders.
Yeah.
What would you say to them in regards to kind of this mental health topic, and what would you give yourself as advice back when you were starting out?
I think advice is very hard to execute, especially advice like this, where the only way to really learn it is to be on the other side of it. So when I give the advice not to identify yourself too much with your startups and not to get confused of who you are with what you do, the only way to actually figure out how to deal with that, I think, is to go through the process. So I'm trying to modify my advice so that it becomes a little more actionable. So I will tell people, when you are at your highest high, remember that you are not as good as you think you are, but you are also never as bad as they say you are. Right? To even out that roller coaster, to give yourself some perspective. Some people learn how to meditate. Some people learn how to actually ground themselves in some other hobby or activity so that they can find perspective. Because I think a lot of our struggles with our ego and our how oppressive our problems may be come from the fact that we do not have the perspective that we used to when we got started, or when we're at our best or at our worst.
Yeah. And I'll just say that you're not as bad as they say you are. That "they" is oftentimes the voice in your head.
Yeah.
It's what you say about yourself, because you kind of know how to cut yourself the deepest in terms of that voice. And in regards to, so answering that question, are you an entrepreneur?
I am an entrepreneur. Yeah. So right now I'm working on a project at YC. They're in their research unit to build better cities that everybody can afford, because that is actually a matter of surviving our climate change that's going to happen. And so to me, I joke that it's the same thing as posting cat photos on the internet, right? And we all laugh because building cities has clearly nothing to do with posting cat photos on the internet, and what my experience from one doesn't really translate to the other. However, what's important here is that I've learned how to be an entrepreneur along the process, and I don't know if what I learned is enough for what I'm going to do, but I sure as well I'm going to find out.
So where that inner resilience, right?
Yeah,
I'm sure as hell going to find out, where does that come from the second time around? Because we often talk to a lot of first-time founders. But what about the second time around?
Second time around, it's nice knowing what you've been able to go through. Like, you know what you're made of and the lessons that's been taught to you. Actually, Rich Lemondov, one of our investors, when I was leaving the company, we had a last phone call, and he said to me, Ben, it takes $50 million to teach a CEO, to train a CEO. And so far I've raised like 47.5 million. So I was like, shit, I gotta raise 2.5 more. But his advice is like really, he has seen so many investments and he's been around since the early days of tech. And his point is absolutely right, that like you have to see so much crap out there. You must have gone through so much pressure to know like what you're made of. And right now, the only thing that I'm made of are my values. Like, that's the really key part here, is like I am made of the things that I believe in about myself, and that is going to drive my actions going forward. I will fail at it. I will not be able to execute on my values every single day for every single decision, but I know what they are. I know what makes me happy, and that's going to ground me in a perspective no matter how big or how problematic my future becomes, because I know that at the core, like, I love these things, and I know these things to be true, and I can always return home to those things.
Yeah.
So.
One of the things Ben discovered on his journey, which we work with a lot of CEOs on, is, look, there's a lot of stuff out there that you have no control over, but there is one thing that you have absolute control over, and that is your values, your ethics, and how you play the game, right? No one can take that away from you. And oftentimes what we find as we work with CEOs is they spend so much time trying to be what is expected of them, they never ask the question of, who am I? And so when somebody comes to me and says, hey, so-and-so did, it used to be Steve Jobs did this, Elon Musk does that, I'm like, yeah, but you're not them, right? Yeah. And if you want to feel really terrible about yourself every morning, keep running that comparison, right? And so the biggest gift that we do is, who are you? And what kind of company are you here to build in the way that you can build it? I was a turnaround CEO directly before becoming a CEO coach, and there's really only a couple reasons why a board fires you. But one of the ways that I see It happened all the time. And it usually comes with the CEO feeling terrible about themselves and depressed, and is when they ask the board, what should I do? What should I do? What should I do? And they keep living outside of themselves. That disconnection of who you truly are and who the world wants you to be is kind of really fertile soil for depression. Because you wake up every morning, even if you end up winning, they love you, but they don't actually love you. They love who you've been pretending to be.
I also think it's important that when you go from a CEO of a 1-person, 2-person, 5-person startup to a CEO of a 50+ person company, that there's actually like a state change that happens. Like you're actually going from like water to steam, right? And you're changing like what you have to do, how you hold yourself accountable. Like everything you know about your job will evaporate. And that stage, that phase change really is about being able to do everything and talk to everyone, and being able to have a hand in it, to the person who is a guiding like principle for the company, holding everybody to a higher standard. And that is no one really talks about that. Like they don't tell you when it's happening. Like I wish I could see a moment in a CEO's career, and I'm like, you're about to go through a phase change. Here's how everything will change. Yeah. And I think we are just starting to discover as an industry that you have to help people through that transition.
Yeah.
So
I mean, and this shows up all the time. So imagine, let's say you're a technical founder, right? And so you coded the first version of whatever it is that you've launched. You've gotten people to join the company. You've gotten people to write checks. So you've raised millions. And when you hit this growth phase, somewhere between 50 and 100 people, you're asked to stop doing everything that got you where you are, that you're really good at, that's raised millions of dollars and hired 40, 50 to 100 people. Stop doing that thing and start doing this thing that you have no idea how to do.
Yeah.
Right? That is a moment in which you have this crisis of identity, right? I have the success I have because of who I am and what I've done, and now I'm being asked to do something else. That's kind of, and you'll see one of two things happen. You'll see them kind of knuckle down and get in the weeds, and then you'll get a frustrated executive team and the wheels start coming off the bus and all of that. Or people will make the leap, and they can't really make that leap without a supportive board, without some sort of peer network. Obviously, I'm a believer in having a coach and whatnot, but that's that change. Stop everything you're good at that's gotten you here and start doing this thing that you have no idea how to do.
And I would also add that like when we talk about our emotion and talk about mental health and depression and things like that, I think a lot of people out there will dismiss as like this soft fuzzy thing, right? This like wishy-washy, oh, emotion, you should be logical, you should be a fucking, machine. And I think that's complete, utter bullshit, because what happens is that our brain has multiple ways of processing information. Our body has multiple ways of communicating our thoughts. And some of it is the logical narrative that we can communicate with right now, and the other is your emotional being. And that is actually driven by science. We know today from scanning our brains in fMRIs, by looking at studies of genetics, that our brain and our emotions actually work in tandem. It is not a separate thing. Your emotions come from here. They express themselves to the rest of your body, but your emotions are a massively parallel processing engine. Your cognitive logic system is a serial engine where you can use it to actually tell stories and narratives. And we tend to overvalue one over the other, and it's time we stop that. It's time we recognize that our emotions are part of our thinking process that affects your decisions, and that you can actually use your emotions by understanding it to make better decisions. And so if we as a society want to get past the debate of like ignore your emotions and go with your logic, we need to recognize that our brain is actually one component.
Yeah. We have this quote. We do this thing called CEO Boot Camp at Reboot, and Ben's been. We have this quote that we often shows up at least on one of the days in one of the slides. It's from Carl Jung, and it says, "Until we make the unconscious conscious, it will drive our life, and we will call it fate." And I think that's what comes to mind as Ben says. What he's saying is we ignore this part of us, we stuff it down, but it's still driving. Whether you like it or not. And it can either drive you unconsciously, or you can pay attention to it for yourself, for those that work for you. If not for you, do it for them. And it feels like it's an Oscar speech. I got the timer going down.
The microphone's going to start going down.
Exactly, the theme music. But I'll just leave you with that. Your emotions are running all of the time. You feel something right now. And you can either pay attention to it and have it be your superpower, or you can ignore it and have it be your kryptonite. But either way, it's running. And I thank Ben for taking the time to talk about his journey, and I thank kind of this packed house, standing room only, for caring enough about mental health to be here today.
And thank you, Khalid, so much for doing this. Appreciate it.
Awesome.
Thanks.
Thank you.